is the world of populations who do care. People in Britain care about what happens to Britain. People in Austria care about what happens to Austria. People in the US care about what happens in the US. They want peace, broadly speaking. They want what people always want. They want safety for their families. They want opportunities for their families. They want to be able to go to work. They want to see their children educated. And these are all natural human desires. But the other world that's existing simultaneously is the world of the powerful. And I think it feels increasingly that someone who's nominally in charge of Britain demonstrably doesn't care about Britain. And people that are in charge of nations across Europe demonstrably don't care about the wants and needs of their populations and the wants and needs of those countries, because they're involved in this bigger game of power where populations are just incidental and collateral damage in the face of this increasingly desperate, I would say, attempt to maintain a status quo that keeps the powerful and wealthy, and devil take the hindmost for everybody else.
Well, I think you're almost too polite and too soft-spoken on this issue. I would go a step further and say that it's not that they don't care. I think in many cases they're openly opposed to their own people. I'm always reminded, I know this is years in the past, I'm sure you remember it, when Gordon Brown was caught with a hot mic, and he was, when he talked to some elderly lady about the problems of what we would call the common people. Then when they drove away and his mic was still on, he said, oh, this person was absolutely dreadful and how horrible. And this is what they think of us, if I might say so, right? This is, Keir Starmer is not if you want, a neutral arbiter in these things. I would argue, if I look at what happened in the UK over the last couple of years, and not as bad as the Tories, or worse than the Tories, but the Tories, I would say, fall in a similar category. In many areas, these are policies that are pursued actively against the interest of the British people. Or I think the problem, you described it quite nicely, Neil, they don't even have a conceptualization of what the British people actually are. This is why we have these, to be honest, completely absurd, although very important, discussions about migration. Everybody in Britain knows intuitively what it means to be British, but those who are in charge of Britain apparently have no idea. And one of the things that came to mind during the V-Day and the celebrations and all of this was that very often there is a lamentation by the media and by politicians that there is such a small number that's willing to die for their country. But I think the tragedy is not that there are so few people that want to die for the country. The tragedy is there are so few countries that are worth dying for. And I think that is truly one of the major lessons. What everyone thinks about World War I and World War II, and God help us all that these things never happen again. I think we all agree on that. But the reason why we call them the greatest generation in the United States, but I think similarly over here as well, is because we know that they have accomplished something that we probably could no longer do. And this, as I said, the kind of test that those two wars were was the most horrible test you can imagine. But I would say overall, they passed it. And to be very clear here, this is a controversial thing I'm saying, but I say it nonetheless. I would include in this, of course, the German and the Russian soldiers as well. They might serve in the name of an evil regime. I'm the last one to deny this. And this is a direct quote from the late French president François Mitterrand. I mean, one cannot deny that when their fatherland called upon them, right, when the storm was blowing, if you want, and they were called upon to march, they marched. I have a certain sense of admiration for that. Again, I said, I hope I never have to trade places with them. I hope I'm never in that kind of situation. But that was a generation that after 1945 rebuilt continental Europe, that rebuilt Great Britain, that sent somebody to the moon in the 1960s. So there was something different. And this is not just nostalgia. Because people say, oh, this is just the old nostalgia and everything was better in the past. I'm not saying that everything was better in the past, but I think the social capital, the quality of the people, if you want, was different. As I said, I don't want to go back. I don't want to trade places with them. There is nothing wrong with admitting, or at least entertaining the thought, that maybe the generations that came before us, first of all, still have something to teach us, and maybe in some areas that matter, were superior to us or to how we are today. That might sound very provocative, and I'm happy to admit if I should be wrong, but that's at least the feeling that I'm having.
You're quite right, though, when you say that are there countries worth dying for? We are reaping the whirlwind. We are harvesting the bitter crop that's been sown, inasmuch as there have been generations who've been progressively taught that their countries are shameful and that the pasts of their countries are shameful. And then, all of a sudden, the latest, youngest generation are expected to contemplate fighting and dying for something they have been taught is indefensible. It's a strange paradox that the youngest generations have been offered. And I think that's why we have an existential crisis, because it has been deliberately made a world in which we've been taught that countries don't matter. Other things matter, such that you can't then try to replay the greatest hits and say now is the time to be patriotic. Patriotic about what? When you've told me I'm the inheritor of a shameful colonialist, imperialist past, and now you want me to contemplate shedding blood to defend that flag. It doesn't make sense. It's not joined up thinking, is it?
But it's even, I think you're absolutely right, but it's even worse than that. Because the idea of the, as you described, of the status quo elite is not even that you die for your flag, it's pretty much that you die for somebody else's flag. Now, as I said, I have my own idiosyncratic views on all the conflicts currently in the world, but one thing I believe that you and all your viewers agree on is whenever a British soldier is called upon to potentially kill in the name of his country and die for his country, that it should be for his country. For anybody, whether it's, I don't care if it's India, Ukraine or Israel, you name it, I honestly don't care. The point is, unless you can make a very strong and convincing case why this is in the interest, as we said before, of the British people, unless you can make that case, to be quite frank, I don't really care. And this is the problem we have today. So first, as you said, first you reprogram, and I think that is an accurate term here, an entire generation in abandoning their traditions, in abandoning their civilizations, in abandoning all the values that kept them together, that made them part of quote-unquote British society. And then you think you can just switch a flip or flip a switch and have this back on, and then almost target it at the one specific thing you want to aim it at. So you want to convince British people to say it is absolutely crucial that Ukraine remains Ukrainian, that whatever other conflict in whatever country you want to take. But if anybody in Britain then raises his hand and says, well, I would really like for Britain to remain British, then you're labeled a racist, a Nazi, a fascist, and in the worst case, you're thrown in prison, or at least you get a visit by the police. And this is something that most people in Britain do not understand, and they are right not to understand it. Because it is, first of all, it's so deeply un-British. And you said something else, Neil, that's very, very important. I was on your show 2 years ago and said that because that had really good, lots of people watched it, so it's worthwhile remembering every one of it. Well, we discussed whether or not Europe, including the UK, is in a pre-revolutionary phase. And I think, yes, we still are. And what you described before is the key thing here. We are currently in an institutional crisis. And every revolution begins with a crisis, right? The French Revolution began with a financial crisis, so to speak. The American Revolution began with a taxation crisis. The Russian Revolution began with the crisis triggered both by World War I and also the Russian-Japanese War and all these things. So 1948, right, the revolutions began with the impact of industrialization. So every revolution had an institutional crisis before. The question is which countries will be able to adapt to this crisis and which countries won't. And the reason why I'm saying this is, whatever Donald Trump does, and I don't want to switch the topic, but I think that's important to say, he tries to answer to the crisis. I think Donald Trump, he would never admit it, that maybe he doesn't understand it, cognitively, but intuitively. He's a symptom of that crisis. This is the thing, we would never have gotten Trump if there wouldn't have been a crisis before. And that crisis is still going on. And I believe the United States, with their trade policy, with bringing back manufacturing, and I don't know if it's going to work, but at least they tried, with strengthening the working class again. That's how they try to address the crisis and thereby also save the existing institutions. Can you save the existing institutions in Germany? Can you save the existing institutions in the UK? When more and more people start to think, justifiably so in many cases, that these very institutions are being abused by the status quo elites to diminish, blackmail, and destroy the opposition. Because once people think that it's not just the parties, Labour, the German conservatives, you name them, are operating against the people, if they think the very system is operating against the people, their revolution will not just be aimed at, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch, whoever it is. Their revolution will be targeting the entire system in itself. And that is much, much more dangerous and much more worrisome than anything else. But unfortunately, as you said so eloquently, Neil, they don't get it. They think all of this is just a protest vote. Oh, people vote for reform. They vote for Nigel Farage. Oh, this is going to blow over. We just have to, eyes closed, finger in your ears, and then we just power through. And then people will say, we tried it and it didn't work out. And let's go back to the Tories. Let's go back to Labour. Let's go back to the Social Democrats. This is not going to happen. We are, as you said, we are in the pre-revolutionary phase where people increasingly feel that their vote, their voice, no longer matters. And at some point, they will use alternative ways of making their feelings, their justified feelings, and their desires recognizable. And that can be a very, very unpretty picture. And again, I'm not wishing for it. I'm just saying that at some point, this is the only chance you have if you feel that everything is going to the wrong direction and no legal path towards affecting change is open for you. You have at some point to take the illegal path. Again, I'm not encouraging it. I'm not wishing for it.